Welcome to Greek 2. In this lecture, we're going to focus on the middle and passive forms. Now, we already looked at the present middle and passive indicative. Just for a quick refresher, the present middle, my, psi, tai, meta, stay, and tie. So this is the present, middle, or passive suffixes my, psi, tai, meta, este, and tie. Now, when you apply this to luo, remember we always went by luo, which is for lose. So how does it work in practice? Well, for this, it becomes luo mai, lu a. This is a different form. Lu etai. And then lu, let me see if I can write on this side here. This is the singular, first, second, third, present middle or present passive indicative. And so I'm kind of writing everywhere here. Plural would be luo meta, lu este, and lu on tie. So this is your present middle or passive forms, verb conjugation. But now there's more. So let's dive into chapter 13 in Dr. Black's book, because we're going to look at the present middle and passive, and then the future indicative or future middle indicative. So let's begin. So let's start with the present, middle, and passive indicative, again using luo as our stem. How does it go? Remember, this is present perfect middle, so you always have the reduplication. Remember that from our perfect indicative active. So here, perfect middle still has that reduplication. So it becomes lelu mai, lelu sai, lelu tai, lelu meta, lelu ste, lelun tai. This is on page 92 of Dr. Black's book. And this is both for the perfect middle and passive indicative of luo. But then here's something he introduces, which is a future middle indicative of luo, future middle, okay? So how does that work? Remember this S? Remember for how in future forms the S would show up, and it would be luso, luces kind of thing. But here, lusomai, luce, lucetai, lusometa, luceste, lusontai. So remember that sigma that makes it future. And there is no prefix. If you notice here, no prefix here, just simply the stem and then sigma and then the middle endings. Also, while we're at it, how about the future indicative of ami? Remember ami, to be, I am. Ami e esten, esmen este esen, right? Or for imperfect, amen es esta en, amen emethe, ete esan, a. But here, for future middle indicative, it would be esomai, esse, estai, esometha, eseste, esontai. And this is your future middle. Remember, we talked about the three voices in Greek. You have the active, you have the passive, and then you have the middle. Active, Subject does the action on the verb, on the word, on the object. Passive, subject receives the action. Middle, we've been discussing this, is it stands in its own right. Does it always have a reflexive action like in the English? Not necessarily, but it does mean that somehow the subject is benefited, the subject is affected. It also has some special nuances that we will see in a different lecture. And many times I'm covering these concepts which are not necessarily discussed in the introductory Greek textbook, because many times students are frustrated because they go, I'm doing all these exercises, but then when I go to read the Greek New Testament, it seems like it's a whole different language. What is happening here? Why is it that I can do this, the textbook, but when it comes to the actual Greek New Testament, those translations don't make sense? So I'm covering these topics, these issues, the most cutting edge discussion regarding middle passive, or if you remember our previous lectures on the aspect or action sort, if you remember all that, I'm using grammars that are as up to speed as possible, advanced grammars to be exact, so that when you do translate the New Testament Greek, or you go beyond first year into second or third year Greek, that you're not shocked or confused or discouraged. You're expecting these things. You're expecting more, okay? So there we have the future, middle, indicative. Well, let's move along to chapter 14, where now we're dealing with the secondary tenses. Remember, we talked about the primary tenses, mai, sai, tai, meta, este, and tai. But secondary tenses is what you are seeing over here. Main, so, to, meta, este, onto. So these are your secondary tenses. Primary tenses are found under section 81. Section 81 in Dr. Black's book is found on page number 86 in chapter 12. But secondary tenses are here on page 97 in chapter 14. But let's apply this. Let's apply these secondary tenses and to the imperfect middle passive and the first aorist middle, okay? Because they take those secondary tenses. So let's start with the imperfect middle passive. This is found on page 98. Since it's imperfect, it comes with a prefix e, as you can see. But then, secondary tenses, eluomen, eluu, elueto, eluometha, elueste, eluonto. Okay, based on the secondary tenses, and of course we're discussing the imperfect middle or imperfect passive. They're the same, if you can see that right here. But then, how about the first aorist middle? Okay, first aorist middle, the major difference is, if you remember in our previous lessons, especially last semester, the sigma, right? Sigma shows up in your future as well as your aorist. Difference between future and aorist is that aorist has the prefix a. So how do you say this? This is the first aorist middle. Elusamen, eluso, elusato, elusametha, elusaste, elusanto. Okay? But that's just your first aorist, because there's also a second aorist middle indicative. And for example, the verb lepo. Okay? So how does it work with lepo? Right here. Elipomen, elipu, elipeto, elipometa, elipeste, eliponto. Now, often students get a little frustrated. They can say, is there another paradigm that we have to memorize? Is this another one that we have to remember? Yeah, you do. This is part of what you have to do. But, be careful about just rote memorization. First semester, yes, because a lot of those forms do come back. So it's important to just memorize them. But in the second semester, you need to start using your head and start seeing these constructions, because it's hard to memorize these hundreds of paradigms, or at least, 30, 40, 50 some paradigms. How do you memorize them? Whether it's for the verbs or for the nouns, for the adjectives, for the pronouns. And then there's more coming. How do you do this? Well, you do need to memorize, but use your head. You think what is happening here. So here, what is happening is the second aorist middle, which of course takes the secondary tenses. Now, there's one more, which is the pluperfect middle and passive indicative of luo. And the reason that they are split apart, that chapter 13 is perfect and then chapter 14 is pluperfect, is because perfect takes on the primary tenses and pluperfect takes on the secondary tenses. Like you see here, elelumen, eleluso, eleluto, elulumetha, elululeste, elulontai. So these are the pluperfect, middle, and passive, again, based on the luo stem, to lose. Now we come to chapter 15, where we are introduced to aorist and future passive indicative. And they're both based on the aorist passive form or tense. So let's begin with first aorist passive indicative, again based on luo. Eluthein, eluthes, eluthe, eluthemen, eluthete, elutheson. Now, since it's aorist, we know there's the E augment, the prefix. And then, because it is based on the aorist passive stem, there is the thein, tes, te, themen, tete, tesan. So this is why it is done that way with the te. Now, moving along to the second aorist passive, it is without the theta, so it still has the E or a because of being an aorist. And because it's based on the aorist passive stem, it still has the ein, es, a, amen, ete, esan, but no theta because it's a second aorist based on grapho. So, egraphen, egraphes, egraphe, egraphemen, egrafete, egraphesan. This is your second aorist passive indicative. And while we're on it, first future passive indicative of luo. How does that look? First future passive indicative, again based on this aorist passive, is luthesomai, luthese, luthesetai, luthesometha, lutheseste, luthesontai. So the sigma is there, but because it is future aorist, future passive indicative, it has the theta in it. But this is just the first future passive indicative. How about the second? Well, the second looks like this without the theta. So is graphesomai, graphese, graphesetai, graphesometha, grapheseste, graphesontai. This is your second future passive indicative of grapho. Second future passive indicative of grapho. So we need to keep this in mind. And this again, there's a short section on page 104 where Dr. Black discusses irregular passive forms. And again, based on the dentals, the labials, gutturals, where the combination almost is unrecognizable. So if you look at this ago, I lead, the stem is ag, aorist passive becomes ichthein, but then look at the future passive, ak tesomai. This sort of does look like the ago, but how about the ichthane? So these are your irregular. What do you do with them? Well, they have to be sort of memorized because that's just what it is. So also baptizo, baptid is the stem, aorist passive is a baptisthane, future passive a baptist te somai, te indicating the passive, sigma indicating the future. Okay? And then peto, again, it's a tough one, but the stem is peit, aorist passive, of course, because it's an aorist, epesthane, and future passive, no need for an augment because it's a future, it's not aorist, but it's definitely a theta, definitely a sigma, pestesomai, pestesomai. So these are the various forms when it comes to the middle and the passive. How do you memorize them? Well, as I mentioned in previous lessons, as I mentioned in the introduction to this course, as I mentioned in the review over the past semester, sit down with the book. Sit down with Dr. Black's book and just read it. Read those chapters, highlight it, underline it, go back over it. And what you'll find is that many times we have these questions, but the answer is in the book, but we haven't taken the time to read it through and through. We simply go from, I got to memorize this, I can memorize that, or here's a vocabulary. We don't take time to read those paragraphs, those sections. Take the time to read them. He has covered a lot of these issues in these chapters. And what he's not covering, or what sometimes research is not updated, I'm covering in these lectures, like the special lecture on the aspect, or the special lecture on the middle, or the passive, or the deponency, and how that has come to an end. These are ways that I'm supplementing this so that down the road, you will not only understand Koine Greek, Biblical Greek better, but also when you read the New Testament in Greek, or begin to do second level, second year Greek, that it would not be confusing and frustrating and discouraging, that you will understand the nuances represented by the aspect. You will understand the nuances of the middle. That middle stands on its own. And English grammar does help us, but English grammar can also be misleading because Greek grammar stands on its own 2 feet. So hopefully this will help you understand the middle and passives of the Greek.